Ian Roussel built his name by doing what most people thought could not be done. He could look at a wreck that seemed beyond saving, cut it apart with total confidence, and somehow turn it into something unforgettable. On television, that made him look fearless, almost untouchable. But behind the work, behind the strange beauty of those machines, Ian was paying a price that viewers were never really shown. Long before Ian Roussel became the recognizable builder from Full Custom Garage, he was already living a life that made it clear he would never follow a normal path. Born in Sunland, California, even the details of his birth carried a strange story, including a clerical mistake that reportedly listed the wrong birth year on his driver's license. Fans argued about his real age for years, but Ian himself never seemed to care. He joked about it, showing the same attitude he carried through most of his life. He was never interested in polishing his image. He cared far more about building things than explaining himself. That mindset began at home. His father, Jerry, worked at Lockheed's Skunk Works and often brought leftover aircraft aluminum back to the family garage. Instead of treating it like scrap, young Ian saw opportunity. While other kids were playing outside, he spent hours learning how metal could be shaped and turned into something useful. He and his father worked side by side for years, eventually logging thousands of hours together building small projects and early vehicles. For Ian, fabrication was never a hobby he discovered later. It was the language he learned to speak from childhood. His mother, Donna, quietly documented those early years, saving photos and notes about his projects long before anyone imagined television would be interested in them. Those records later helped tell the story of how his career began. Even as a kid, Ian did not think about cars the way most people did. He was fascinated by shape and design rather than simple performance. He would experiment with forms, carving models, and building mock-ups just to understand how a vehicle's lines could be transformed. School never felt like the place where that kind of thinking belonged. Ian could excel in metal fabrication, but cared little about traditional academics. At graduation, he famously parked a half-finished custom truck outside the gym, showing everyone exactly where his future was headed. He even turned down a drafting scholarship, saying college could not weld. Instead of studying design in a classroom, he chose to learn directly in garages and workshops. The early years were far from glamorous. Ian struggled financially and sometimes lived inside his own shop while trying to keep his business alive. He took whatever work he could get, experimenting with unusual designs and learning from builders across Southern California. Those difficult years shaped his mentality. By the time he opened his own shop in his early 20s, he was already used to surviving without security, relying only on skill, vision, and relentless work. That mindset eventually helped him become one of the most recognizable custom builders in the country. But it also meant he spent years pushing himself harder than most people ever would. Long before the cameras arrived, Ian Roussel had already proven he could endure almost anything. What he did not yet realize was that the success that finally followed would eventually demand a price even he might struggle to pay. Ian Roussel's rise in the custom car world may have looked sudden, but in reality, it took years of quiet work. Long before people recognized his name, he was already learning fabrication in Southern California, spending his days around experienced builders and his nights experimenting with his own ideas. While many shops focused on restoring classic cars exactly as they were, Ian was doing the opposite. He cut roofs off vehicles others would have preserved, welded parts from different models together, and reshaped metal until the cars looked like rolling sculptures. Some traditionalists disliked his approach, but others were fascinated, and slowly people began talking about the unusual builder creating something completely different. Opening his own shop at a young age was a risky move. He had limited tools, constant financial pressure, and no guarantee that customers would come through the door. Still, Ian made one simple promise: he would build anything. That attitude quickly set him apart. While other builders rejected strange or complicated ideas, Ian accepted them. Clients who wanted unusual combinations of parts or radical designs found someone willing to experiment. Word spread naturally as satisfied customers told others, and soon car enthusiasts began stopping by just to see what he was creating. A turning point came when one of Ian's rat rod builds appeared at a major car show in Las Vegas. He had nearly abandoned the project because of budget problems, but when it finally appeared at the event, it became one of the most talked-about vehicles there. Photographers and collectors crowded around it, asking who had built something so unusual. A documentary about the build soon circulated among car enthusiasts, and interest in his work grew rapidly. Orders began arriving from across the country, and eventually from international collectors. Cars built in Ian's small shop were being shipped overseas to places like Japan and Europe. The custom car community had discovered someone who was willing to break traditional rules and reinvent old machines instead of simply restoring them. That bold approach made his work stand out, but success also brought pressure. As collectors, media, and car shows paid more attention to his builds, expectations grew. Every new project needed to be more ambitious than the last. The creativity that had once been driven by curiosity was now accompanied by the responsibility of maintaining a reputation. By the time television producers finally noticed Ian, he had already established himself as one of the most unconventional builders in the industry. His workshop was filled with machines that looked more like art than transportation. For producers searching for something authentic, the sight of one man shaping metal in a desert workshop felt completely different from the dramatic reality shows dominating television. That authenticity made him perfect for a new kind of automotive program. But the opportunity that would soon bring him global attention would also begin changing the life he had built, including the freedom that had always defined the way he worked. When Full Custom Garage finally premiered on television, it immediately stood apart from nearly every other automotive show on the air. Most programs in the genre relied on loud personalities, manufactured deadlines, and dramatic arguments between team members. The formula was predictable. A client would appear with an unrealistic demand. The builders would panic about time, tempers would flare, and the finished car would be revealed just seconds before the clock supposedly ran out. Ian Roussel's show looked nothing like that. Instead of chaos and shouting, viewers saw something quieter and far more unusual. One man working alone in a workshop in the Mojave Desert, shaping metal with patience while explaining his thought process as he went. The pace was slower, but the craftsmanship was mesmerizing. From the beginning, audiences sensed that what they were watching was real. Ian did not rely on computer renderings or carefully planned blueprints. He often walked around a car silently for a few minutes thinking, before cutting into the body with complete confidence. Sometimes, he changed direction halfway through a build because the metal suggested a better idea. Instead of hiding mistakes, he explained them. That honesty became one of the defining characteristics of the show. Fans felt as though they were witnessing the mind of a craftsman at work rather than watching a rehearsed television performance. The series gradually built a loyal following. Viewers studied his techniques, rewinding segments to understand how he achieved certain curves or structural modifications. Car enthusiasts from around the country began traveling to the Mojave Desert just to see the workshop where the vehicles were being built. For them, the location itself became almost legendary. The small shop sitting in the vast desert landscape represented something rare in modern television, a place where creativity seemed to exist without corporate interference. But the reality behind the camera was more complicated. Television always changes the rhythm of work, even when it tries to appear natural. Each episode required a finished vehicle within a specific production window. That meant builds that might normally take months sometimes had to be compressed into far shorter periods of time. Filming schedules dictated when certain steps had to happen, even if the timing was not ideal for the project itself. Ian had spent years building cars according to instinct and patience, but now the clock of a television schedule was always ticking in the background. The physical environment added another layer of strain. The Mojave Desert workshop, where most of the show was filmed, was not designed as a modern production facility. It was essentially a metal building exposed to the brutal desert climate. During the summer months, temperatures regularly climbed well above 100 degrees. Inside the shop, the heat from welding equipment, grinders, and engines made the air even heavier. Working in those conditions had always been part of Ian's life, but filming intensified everything. Long days meant spending hour after hour under lights, near hot metal, and inside a building that trapped the desert heat. Production schedules often stretched to 13-hour days. The cameras needed multiple angles. Certain scenes had to be repeated so editors could capture clear explanations of the build process. For viewers at home, the finished episode might feel relaxed and natural, but achieving that look required enormous effort behind the scenes. Ian was not just building cars anymore. He was also performing the process of building them for an audience, even if he tried to keep the performance as subtle as possible. At the center of this complicated life was his partnership with his wife, Jamie. While Ian handled the fabrication, Jamie gradually became responsible for much of the work that kept the business functioning. She communicated with clients, managed scheduling, and eventually became deeply involved in production and editing. What viewers saw as a one-man show was actually supported by an enormous amount of unseen labor behind the scenes. Jamie carried a large part of that weight, often while dealing with the same desert conditions and the growing pressure of a television audience. For several seasons, the arrangement seemed to work. The show continued to grow in popularity, and Ian's reputation as one of the most original builders in the custom car world only became stronger. The moment everything began to unravel did not look dramatic at first. There was no headline, no announcement that something serious had happened behind the scenes of Full Custom Garage. To viewers, the show continued the same way it always had. Cars were being built, metal was being cut, and Ian Roussel still appeared calm and focused while explaining his process. But the truth was that years of relentless work under extreme conditions were finally starting to take their toll on his body. The Mojave Desert can be beautiful from a distance, but working there day after day is a different experience entirely. Summer temperatures in that region often climb far beyond what most people would consider safe working conditions. Inside the metal workshop, where Ian spent most of his time, the heat could become overwhelming. Welding torches, grinders, and running engines added even more heat to the environment, creating a space where the temperature was often far higher than what the weather reports outside suggested. For someone who had already spent years pushing himself physically, the environment slowly became dangerous. During filming, the pressure to keep working never really disappeared. Television schedules rarely allow long breaks, especially once production is underway. Ian was used to long hours, but filming turned those hours into something even more demanding. Cameras needed to capture each stage of the process. Explanations had to be repeated for clarity, and builds that would normally progress slowly were sometimes pushed forward faster than the body could comfortably handle. For a long time, Ian simply endured it the way he always had. That was how he had built his career in the first place. Eventually, however, the body stops negotiating. One day, while working under the desert sun, Ian collapsed from severe heat exhaustion. The temperature had climbed well above what anyone should have been working in, and he had been standing near running equipment in heavy protective gear with very little relief from the heat. The collapse was serious enough that paramedics had to be called. It was not a minor incident that could be ignored and forgotten. Doctors later explained that the episode resembled heat stroke, and the long-term consequences included damage to his kidneys. Years of working in extreme heat had slowly pushed his body past its limits. For a man whose identity was tied to endurance and determination, that moment carried a deeper meaning than just a medical emergency. Ian had always believed he could keep going as long as the work demanded it. Suddenly, his body was telling him that the price of continuing the same way might be far higher than he had imagined. While he was dealing with that physical crisis, another loss struck him personally. Fans of Full Custom Garage had grown familiar with a quiet presence in the background of many builds. Ian's dog, known simply as Dude, often wandered through the workshop during filming. He was never introduced as a character on the show, but viewers came to recognize him as part of the environment. Dude was there while cars were being cut apart, while welders sparked, and while finished builds rolled out of the shop. In many ways, he represented the calm center of Ian's world. When Dude became seriously ill with cancer, Ian shared the situation with his followers. Many people who had watched the show for years felt a surprising emotional connection to the animal who had quietly accompanied so many builds. The treatments were difficult, and the outcome was ultimately heartbreaking. When Dude passed away, Ian announced it in a short message online, explaining that his companion had lost a long battle with cancer. For viewers, it was sad news. For Ian, it was far more personal. The dog had been beside him through some of the hardest years of his career. Losing that constant presence at the same time he was dealing with health problems and growing exhaustion from television production felt like the final weight in an already heavy situation. The combination of these events forced Ian to confront something he had avoided for years. The success of Full Custom Garage had given him a worldwide audience and a reputation many builders could only dream of achieving. Yet maintaining that success required a level of sacrifice that was becoming impossible to ignore. His health was deteriorating, the production schedule was relentless, and the joy that once came naturally from building cars was being replaced by fatigue. For the first time since the show began, Ian started asking himself a question he had never seriously considered before. What if the life he had built through determination and creativity was now demanding more from him than he could safely give? The answer to that question would soon lead to a decision that shocked fans, confused industry insiders, and completely changed the direction of his career. By the time Ian Roussel reached that point, the decision he was facing was not simple. Walking away from a successful television show is something most people in the entertainment industry would never consider voluntarily. Full Custom Garage had built a loyal audience over many seasons, and Ian had become one of the most recognizable figures in the custom car world. For years, the show had brought attention to his work, attracted new clients, and introduced millions of viewers to the way he built machines that looked more like sculptures than vehicles. From the outside, it appeared to be the kind of success people spend their entire careers chasing. But Ian knew the reality behind that image. The schedule was exhausting, the environment was punishing, and the creative freedom that had originally made the show appealing was slowly shrinking under the weight of television production demands. Every season required more episodes, more builds, and more filming days under conditions that had already proven dangerous. After his collapse and the health warnings that followed, continuing the same routine began to feel less like dedication and more like a risk he could not justify anymore. When Ian finally spoke publicly about his decision, the message was surprisingly simple. He was tired. Not in the casual sense of needing a vacation, but in the deeper sense of someone who had spent years pushing himself beyond what most people would endure. The structure of television had started interfering with the way he naturally worked. Instead of building at the pace that made sense for the project, he was working to satisfy production timelines. Instead of experimenting freely with ideas, he sometimes had to shape projects around what the show needed to film. The creativity that once defined his career was beginning to feel restricted by the very platform that had made him famous. Rather than waiting for the situation to collapse completely, Ian chose to end it on his own terms. He informed the network that he would not continue beyond the final season already in production. There was no public argument with executives and no dramatic farewell tour. The last episodes aired as planned, bringing the series to a natural conclusion after years on the air. For viewers who had followed the show from the beginning, it felt like the end of an era. But for Ian, it was the beginning of something else. Even before the final television episodes finished airing, he had already started building a new path. Together with Jamie, he launched a YouTube channel called Full Custom Ian. The idea behind it was almost the opposite of traditional television. Instead of strict time limits and carefully structured episodes, the videos could follow the real rhythm of a build. Some episodes ran less than 20 minutes, while others stretched far longer depending on what the project required. There were no scripted reactions and no forced drama. If something went wrong during fabrication, the mistake stayed in the video. If a design changed halfway through the build, viewers watched the process unfold naturally. The response from fans was immediate. Many longtime viewers felt they were finally seeing the version of Ian that had always existed behind the edited television format. The channel grew quickly, attracting hundreds of thousands of followers who appreciated the unfiltered look at his work. Jamie's role expanded as well. She stepped fully into the position of producer and editor, shaping the videos and helping transform the channel into a growing independent platform. Another major change soon followed. After years of operating from the well-known Desert Ranch workshop, Ian and Jamie made the difficult decision to close that location. For many fans, the building had become almost symbolic of the show itself. It was where hundreds of builds had taken shape and where viewers imagined Ian working in the heat of the Mojave Desert. Saying goodbye to that space felt emotional for people who had watched the series for so long, but the closure was not the end of the story. The move allowed Ian to relocate to a larger workshop with better ventilation, modern equipment, and proper air conditioning. For the first time in years, he could work without the constant physical strain that had contributed to his earlier health crisis. Projects that once required months of careful scheduling under television constraints could now be approached with patience again. Today, Ian continues building the kind of machines that first made him famous. Rat rods assembled from salvaged industrial parts, rare vintage trucks reshaped into something entirely new, and experimental designs that challenge traditional ideas of what a custom car should look like. The difference is that the work now happens on his terms rather than according to a broadcast schedule. The tragedy people talk about in Ian Roussel's story is not a scandal or a dramatic downfall. It is something quieter and more complicated. It is the realization that success can sometimes push a person so hard that the thing they love begins to disappear. Ian reached that point and made a decision many people never have the courage to make. He walked away before the cost became too high. What do you think about Ian Roussel's decision to leave television and start over on his own terms? Do you think it was the right move for him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more real stories from the world behind the screen.